parents came up and visited here a number of times. And then my mother and Jackie spent a month up here. The next year, my folks purchased a lot, and that was kind of the beginning of our adventure here in Wilsonia. There was a tent top cabin on the property. So this tent top cabin was 2 rooms, 3 or 4 windows. It had a lean-to kitchen off the back, and then there was a privy, and it was a 2-hole privy, and we never quite figured that out.
My dad lived between Arosa and Cutler or Yedem, and there was no air conditioning. I remember growing up, there was no air conditioning. They came up here in the summer and camped there, but we started coming up here in the summers because I, like my uncle, could not stand the heat. So I got to live all my summers and grew up here in Wilsonia. Still no air conditioning.
I was born in 1928, so it was the early 1930s. My sister and I were taken to the mountains, and my father and mother settled on Lodgepole because it was around, I think, 6,700 feet. My father was born in Tulare, actually, and after he and my mother married, built a house here in Tulare. She had always had asthma, but in the summer she was afflicted. So they decided if she got to the mountains, and she felt much better in the mountains, and so they camped, and they ended up camping all 3 months of the summer up there. So that was when my parents heard about Wilsonia in Grant Grove, and went over to investigate, and eventually bought 2 lots. And then I think probably the first year or 2, we camped up there until they were able to build the cabin.
In 1938, the cabin was constructed, and then the tent, I don't know what happened to the tent, but it disappeared. And so we had a cabin, we had a new privy built by the CCC back in the 30s. And so the cabin has kind of evolved from there.
Recently, I found a 3x5 pink card on which Daddy had noted the beginning of the cabin building process. It is dated 6/22/1937, and these words are printed in Daddy's neat civil engineer trained hand. Purchase lots, number 2930, Mesa Edition. First National Bank of Orange Cove, June, July, August, September, $402. 1937 built cabin shell, cost $1,056.86. My childhood was spent there in the summers. We would go up the day after school was out, and it was quite an undertaking, as you can imagine.
My sister and I and my mother would spend most of the summers up here to get away from the heat. My dad had to work, and he had a big garden. Every Friday night he would come up, load the car up. He had a 39 Chevy green 4-door sedan, and I can still remember when he would drive up and we'd open the back end up, it would be loaded with fruits and vegetables, and and they were hot, and I can still remember that smell. We would put the melons in the creek.
I mean, mountain living was so different than being at home. And my mother was a real whiz with a Coleman lanterns, and we all had the glass lanterns with the coal oil that you put in, and they had to be cleaned, and there was a lot to do to keep up in the mountains.
And we would walk around Wilsonia, from cabin to cabin after dark, and we didn't really think about it at all. Up here, when the moon is out, the moon can be very bright and really light your way. When there is no moon, it is dark. And of course, we had candles, we had kerosene lamps, we had Coleman gasoline lamps. If you went to the privy at night, I have a lantern on the mantle. It was my grandfather's. He was an engineer for Southern Pacific passenger trains, and we used that to go to the privy at night.
But back to your days growing up there, it was just a little two-room cabin, enough room in the bedroom for, I guess, 2 double beds. And, so the parents slept there, and the kids all slept outside. They had springs from the old beds, old bed springs, and they'd have those scattered out in the yard.
Yeah, we never slept inside. It was an outside area. It was camping, and that's what you did.
When you go to the mountains, you don't expect it. When people camp, they know it's not going to be like home, and that's one of the reasons they camp. She had a little stove that she cooked on, and I think it was a coal oil. And she had a little oven that she put on it, and she baked. And
we had a wood stove, which you had to do all your cooking on, so you had to haul in wood, of course, or have it available.
The stove in the kitchen initially was from my grandmother in Sacramento, and it was a small black stove. In the late 40s, I can remember this very distinctly, my folks and I went to a farmhouse just northwest of Tulare, and bought an blue enameled quick meal stove that was absolutely beautiful.
My mother gave me baths in a big tin bucket.
They got a wash tub. We still have it, big wash tub.
We didn't have a fireplace. At that time we had an oil stove, and in the late 40s I can remember very distinctly we almost had a fire. The stove overheated. My father would not use it again, and at that point we had a fireplace constructed, and we've been using that ever since.
And in those days, that floor had openings, so if you wanted to sweep it, it all went through the floor to where you got to the door.
You didn't need a dustpan. It went down before you got to the doorway.
And that water up there is cold, and they could make a little kind of rock place. I remember either watching or helping them do that, so you could put your milk in the stream and the things that you wanted to keep cold, and you could do that. But then they also had a kind of it was on a frame. I hadn't thought about this for years, and I didn't write about this, but they had a wire frame that had a door that you could open, and there were kind of, I think, burlap curtains around the sides, and if you kept those wet, and then you could keep cool things inside.
My parents would camp down at Swale Campground and stuff, and we'd wander through, and I can still remember seeing the Collin cabin, and I was so impressed because I thought they had a 2-holer outhouse, because you go by there's 2 doors there at the outhouse. And I was really impressed, and I guess I was in high school when I finally learned that one left side's the outhouse part and the right side's a tool shed. But I just thought those people were really up there because they had a 2-holer. So.
And the outhouse is still there. And the road to Wilsonia to get up here came up the east side of Klingen's Junction. It went down through that valley and came up. And was a long trip getting up here.
As I remember, it was about a 3-hour trip. The car usually boiled, and my dad always carried extra water. So it was a tough trip up. As I remember, coming up through Visalia, Rosa Cutler, Orange Cove, Hills Valley Road, then up to Dunlap, and then Miramonte, and up to Pinehurst.
You know, the cars were slower. There weren't nearly as many cars. They were not in good shape, but especially when you got up in an area where it had snowed, the roads had a tendency to be kind of crumbly on the side. And I remember they had buses, sightseeing buses that came up. But you can imagine they weren't the kind of slick buses you see now.
I remember seeing the cuts that were being made in the to the north along that whole hill. The cuts were being made for the new highway. But my folks were always saying, "Oh, when the new highway is built," and I can remember one of the first times that we used the new highway. And wow, that was fantastic. I didn't get sick. It was just, it was so easy compared to the way it used to be. And, you can still see some of the old roads, and it looks so narrow, but that's the way it was. So we would go up the hill and to Wishbone Cave and to the meadow that's up on the hill. Very few people knew of those places. There are actually Indian potholes up on the hill and above us.
Well, my cousin who lived on the south end of the meadow, and he and I play Indian. We dress up like Indians and go around through the woods.
We used to think we had Indian dwelling places up there in the rocks and such, and our imaginations would just go wild. But the hikes up Azalea Trail to Lookout, across Manzanita Trail, the North Boundary Trail, the Sunset Trail, they were all, readily accessible to us.
At that time, it was a very social experience. Other people had cabins or camping, and it really thrills me to know that Wilsonia has carried on this tradition for so many years.
My parents were great friends with all the people that were in our neighborhood. And my mother used to talk about the weekly potluck dinners they would have. The clubhouse has really been the center of a lot of things over the years, and the different boards have done their best to keep it as in good a shape as possible. And I hope people appreciate that, because it's part of the history, actually. We did a lot of square dancing in the Wilsonia Clubhouse.
And they used to have a lot of square dances here. Every Saturday night there was a square dance in Wilsonia. So that was the big exciting thing.
We would pack up to 11 squares in that clubhouse. That clubhouse really rocked and rolled. It was so much fun. That was there were Saturday night dances, and there were midweek dances. So it was great fun. They did line dances and round dances along with the square dances, and it was terrific. It was a great workout at this altitude, and we had a wonderful time.
I just remember, I know the clubhouse has been used for so many things because it's really the center of activity. Yes, lots of dances, square dances especially, and potlucks, sewing, the quilting, the crafting, that sort of thing. But yeah.
Horses played a big role in Wilsonia. I could mention this. There were several private corrals, plus the Wilsons' animals that they had, and horses were taken on the trails around up Azalea Trail and in the North Boundary Trail and Sunset. It was they played a big role. We never had horses here, but we enjoyed them, renting them and such.
We had horses, so my dad built a corral after our cabin was built. He built a corral behind the cabin. My mother organized these trips, and how many people in that area actually had horses, and we'd go on horse rides together.
We had horses, we rode horses up here, did a lot of that. At that time, there was a corral here in Wilsonia, so we could keep our horses over here.
And we all knew all the horses at the horse corral. We knew the Wilsons, Bud Wilson's parents that owned the horse corral. It was just a tremendous experience.
The original amphitheater was right at the edge of Wilsonia, so they had campfires.
And you never miss those. They were right here to the west of Wilsonia.
The original one was right across from maintenance yards. When you're on the highway and you turn into Wilsonia.
Right.
And opposite of the corral was the amphitheater. And the amphitheater served Grant Grove and Wilsonia.
But they had a little cabin.
It was just off the road.
It had a lock on the doors, had a lock on it, and they had this old piano.
They had a piano.
And a little stage, and not a very big stage. But
There was the stage. There was just on the east side there was a large fire pit, and then the tiers of logs and such that where everyone sat.
The campfire usually started just about the time it got dark, and it was always organized by the ranger. I didn't organize any campfires, but the ranger organized the campfire. He would get up and greet people, and then there would be announcements. And then the first activity was a community sing, and that's where I was involved.
And then I can remember we always sang songs.
The old camp songs, which were really meaningful. But they went back into the old days, and there was always a guitarist or someone, and people would sing, and it was really great, really great.
And in those days, people all knew the same songs. In fact, they had community songbooks. I've been working on the railroad. Let me call you sweetheart, and rounds. And so I read the community singing probably from about the time I was a sophomore in high school. And they always had somebody play the piano. And actually, the pianist for a long time was John Wilson's mother, grandmother. She played, and she never looked at a note of music. You would just say, play Camp Town Races, and she'd play it, And that was fun.
I can remember sitting there as a younger person, looking at that fire, and it was always a great fire.
And the ranger would drive around the campground, Sunset, or the cabins, and ask people to volunteer to play, sing, tell stories. So they had about maybe 20 minutes of volunteer entertainment, and you can imagine how that was. I mean, some of those people were really good, but some of them were not good.
The portrait over my shoulder is of my grandfather. It's a sketch that was done back in the 30s at one of the campfires. He was called out of the audience because the Mr. Buell, who was an artist with the Fresno Bee, recognized my grandfather. And he took a piece of charcoal out of the fire, and I don't know if he carved it a little bit with a knife or whatever, but with that charcoal, he did this portrait.
So after that, then the next part, actually the fourth part of the campfire, was a ranger talk, but all on the park. And there was a music camp up there when I was a youngster called Western Music Camp. It was run by a Fresno man, Major Dillon. People came and took voice lessons. I mean, it was totally organized. It was right across from the Wilsonia store in that meadow. I have no idea how many acres, it must have been a couple of acres.
We had 2 stores, so you could buy your bubble gum.
Jawbreakers, comic books.
Comic, yeah, in those days. And they had a restaurant. Actually, we had 2 restaurants, one at the Lodge and the Dutch Inn.
But the Kings Canyon Lodge, and that had a restaurant, nice restaurant, and then a whole row of like a motel facility behind it. I can just remember going into the coffee shop, having ice cream, or maybe we had a meal there. A number of times. The store itself was quite well supplied. I look back at the time during the 60s, and there was a very dark cloud that hung over Wilsonia. And many cabins were purchased by the government.
In the 70s, the park started putting a lot of pressure on people to get us out of here.
But during those days, really a dark cloud was over Wilsonia because people didn't know what to do. The government loomed very heavy over our heads.
But they sent letters. It was an exerted effort, and they bought and destroyed about 30% of Wilsonia. We had over 300 cabins. We're down to 212 now. So in the early 90s, Dr. Fran Preston, Jim Spitz, and a few others just did a study, had a gentleman do a study, and he felt we could become a historic district. So we formed the historic district.
But it was important just in the life of the village too, because with the pressures from the government, the regulations for not being able to add on or do improvements and everything, the village was kind of declining, and people were hesitant to try and do anything to upgrade, or even people were hesitant to come in and buy because they didn't know what the future would hold for them, and if they would be able to retain their cabin, or if they would come in with some eminent domain or type thing that would take the whole village away. So this really reinvigorated the whole village and brought things to life again, to have some feeling of assurance that we're not going to lose this place, at least not right now.
And I'm very thankful for that, because I want to see my grandchildren, I want to see my great-grandchildren enjoy this place. Thanks.
We received a letter from Bill Tweed, who was the high up in the park. He was just under the superintendent, which really encouraged us to go for the historic district. And that's when we gathered the money It was a major undertaking.
Shortly after the July 1991 meeting in the clubhouse, I wrote a letter to Bill Tweed of the National Park Service, and a few weeks later I got this marvelous letter from Bill. In response to your letter of September 5th, the National Park Service will be delighted to join in an open and friendly dialogue about historic preservation in Wilsonia. I will be happy to meet with you at your convenience to discuss how the National Park Service can support your goal of creating a Wilsonia Historic District. Signed, William Tweed. And that was it. That gave us the courage to persevere. We knew.
I think we collected about $20,000, and we hired the Historic Resource Group. They came in and did a study, did all the paperwork.
That's a lot of work.
Yeah, we spent
Took
3 years.
a lot of time, a lot of work, a lot of dedication on the part of the people that were pushing to get it
The
started.
Historic District. And everybody was very supportive and helpful. And I went to Sacramento in 1996. Jim Spitz and I and a few other people.
My wife and I arose early and were in our car driving to Sacramento by about 6:30 a.m. We walked to the Capitol and soon found Senate Meeting Room 112, a comfortably large, beautifully restored room. Fran Preston was there already. Within a few minutes, other Wilsonia people started arriving. All in all, 12 of us. At 11:52, Christy McAvoy and I walked forward and sat down at a desk with 2 microphones facing the Historic Resources Commission of the state of California. All of our work, starting from that early meeting in our clubhouse in July of 1991, was now to bear or not to bear fruit. Christy spoke first and quickly. She stressed the unique joy that seems to be at the core of Wilsonia. Then it was my turn. My name is James M. Spitz, and I am the president of the Wilsonia Historic District Trust. We are a small community located in an elevation of almost 7,000 feet in the Sierra Nevada mountains, with over 7 decades of continuous, ongoing community activities, of pancake breakfasts, of fundraising auctions, of square dances, and so forth. We also see ourselves as historic. At this point, I recall looking at the commissioners and seeing smiles of support and interest. A dream was soon to be a reality. To pass on to our children and our children's children our rich historic and cultural legacy, we seek classification as an historic district. Chairman Cameron entertained a motion to list Wilsonia as a historic district. The motion was made and seconded, and the panel voted unanimously in our favor. It was 12 noon. What we came for had been accomplished.
Mrs. Tripp, who lived next door at that time, put this cabin in escrow. Barbara and I bought this cabin.
The reason she wanted to even bought this because she had her cabin next door. The roof was the shiny metal. She didn't like looking at that shiny metal, and there was an outhouse in between the cabins, and she didn't like that outhouse. So the provision was we could buy the cabin, but the outhouse has to go, and Mr. Roy had to come up and paint the roof the metal green, and then she was happy. So we were all happy. Anyway, we had a good time with Mrs. Tripp.
Quite a lady. So that's how we ended up here.
Fern Tripp was a really special person. She remembered, she had a memory like an elephant. She knew so much of the history of Wilsonia, and she was very gracious, such a great person to work with.
Being one of the fortunate families whose parents and grandparents had the foresight to spend the summers up here in this beautiful place, I feel very, very lucky. To be part of the special ceremony today is a very exciting event. My dream is for their future children, our children, grandchildren, and their perpetuity to be able to have the same experiences as we had. The place and dreams are what I feel America's made of, and make us all feel closer to God.
What we're doing today is something pretty remarkable. We are indeed sort of announcing to the world that Wilsonia is no longer something that is ephemeral, something that is going to go away. We have established it for its future.
This was the dedication responsive reading. Leader, in memory of its past, in respect for its presence, in hope for its future. Audience, we dedicate Wilsonia. Leader, for the majesty of its trees, the songs of its birds, the color of its wildflowers, the blue of its sky, the glory of its mountains. Audience,
we dedicate Wilsonia.
For the joy of family and friends, for parents and grandparents, for children and grandchildren, for generations and generations to come.
We dedicate Wilsonia. In thankfulness for all past, present, and future, in appreciation of its beauty, in all its many forms, in recognition of its families who bring it life and joy, we dedicate Wilsonia.
we dedicate Wilsonia.
Coming back to Wilsonia every year was like coming home because we knew these folks, we knew their families, everyone helped each other. They were friendly, and I mean it was just like a big family.
But the joys of spending time among these beautiful trees, gorgeous flowers, and singing birds has always had somewhat of a religious feeling to me. And it truly makes it a special place.
You know, this is a storehouse of memories for me. Wilsonia is, and our cabin is. And when we walk the streets in Wilsonia, my mind just goes back to days when, you know, we knew everyone, but each cabin has quite a history. Wilsonia is going through a different stage now. A lot of the older people are gone. I'm now one of the older people, and it's and I'll be gone. But there's a younger element that is here, and that's great.